as our children make their way into children's church, it's always a Sunday that warms our hearts to know that so many give so much for us. A quick program note in the life of the church is some of you have been asking about our Christmas program. And so I want to go ahead and let you know, because you'll begin to see advertisement accordingly, and we want you to invite folks to come. But this year we're going to be celebrating a living nativity. And the title of the program is Come to the Manger. And it will be on the 23rd of December, the evening of the 23rd of December. Our desire is to invite our whole community to come and experience the living nativity, invite them to come to the manger, and then as they come, we invite them to join us for worship the following day, either at our 11 o'clock Christmas Eve service or our 6 p.m. Christmas Eve service. So for your families this year, it's a living nativity. It's called Come to the Manger, and it will be on the 23rd of December. So go ahead and begin to prepare for that. Today I want to bring to a conclusion our interest in the kingdom of heaven. We've been talking about the kingdom of heaven now for 4 or 5 weeks. And where that has brought us is to a critical point in the ministry of Jesus. You heard Pastor Greg read passages from both the 24th and the 25th chapters of Matthew. But what precedes those words that we heard are words that we had heard earlier in our reflection on Jesus' ministry and the kingdom of heaven. It takes us all the way back to when Jesus said that every stone of this resplendent temple that you are exclaiming is so wondrous. Every stone will be brought down. You remember that the disciples and Jesus make their way up to the temple, having come from Galilee. Jesus ministering all through Samaria, makes his way to Jerusalem, and as they arrive, the disciples are gobsmacked. They can't believe the splendor of this temple, how wondrous it is. And in the back of their minds, thinking that, Jesus has already demonstrated that somehow, some way, we're going to be a part of all of this. Somehow, some way, we being associated with Jesus means that somehow we're going to be connected with all this, and isn't this amazing? To which Jesus responds that not a single stone will remain one upon the other. And so as Jesus and his disciples are leaving Jerusalem, having gone to the city center there at the temple, as they leave the temple area and go down and come back up on the side of the Mount of Olives, the disciples get up the courage to ask Jesus, when is all that going to happen? When is it going to happen that all of this splendor is going to be brought to rubble? I mean, Up to this point, they've listened to Jesus and they've been skeptical at times, and on every occasion, Jesus somehow comes through. Time and time again, Jesus says things that strike them as odd or unlikely or impossible, and this time, he seems to be repeating the same pattern of saying something that to the minds of the disciples seems impossible. And so they ask, when is this thing going to happen? And Jesus informs them that this thing is going to happen, and there'll be plenty of signs that it's going to happen. But as for the hour that the Son of Man is going to come back, that's for you hidden. That's very interesting. And we have to go slow here. Jesus acknowledges that all of these things are going to happen, but his disciples are associating with these things what the Scripture calls the end of the age. Because the expectations are so high, Jesus warns them not to be taken in. There will be signs and there will be wonders and there will be figures coming from every direction claiming to be the Messiah associated with the troubles that you're going to experience. And he tells them, do not be taken in. Do not be misled. Do not imagine that someone who rises up in the midst of all these troubles and makes certain declarations and lays claim to being the Messiah or the Son of Man. Be sure that you're not taken in by all that. As for all the troubles, you can count on it, Jesus says. But for the coming of the Son of Man, for the coming of the Messiah, no. Even the Son of Man doesn't know the time for that. Only God himself, or only the Father knows, Jesus tells them. And then he says something very curious. He says, this generation will not pass away before these things happen. This generation will not pass away before these things happen. Now remember, his disciples are listening to this, and he's just been telling them that all kinds of things are going to point to what he has just said is going to happen, to the destruction of the temple. But as for associating the coming of the Messiah with these events, that's not for you to know when. That's very important. And then he says this thing will happen in this generation. Before any of you guys pass away, it's going to happen. And as we all know, Jesus don't lie. And so then he begins to tell them a series of parables and allegories that are meant to help them make sense not only of what he's saying, but what's going to happen to them. He's going to introduce them to these notions through parables so that they can understand the relationships of all these different moving parts to the kingdom of heaven. And this is what he says in the verses that you've just heard. Then the kingdom of heaven will be comparable to 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. He tells the parable of these bridesmaids, these 10 virgins. A parable, the point of which is to allow them to see where they are in relationship to what's taking place. Now let's just go ahead and remind ourselves that in 30 years from this point on, or 33 years from this point on, Jesus is right. All kinds of things are going to take place, the culmination of which is the utter destruction of the temple. It's been gone since 70 A.D. Gone. Jesus was right. This, not a stone upon another stone, happened just like he said it would. And the signs and the warnings and the figures coming claiming to be the Messiah in the midst of all these trouble, all that happened too. The trouble is we try to take Jesus' words where he's trying to guide his disciples about the immediate future that they're all going to experience. And we try to magnify that into some grand scheme or framework through which we can read the world as if it were a prediction for us. Well, it was a prediction, all right. And Jesus said that it was going to happen within the generation of those who were in his hearing. And it did. And then he says, at that time, the kingdom of heaven will be like. Now that's the most important line in the entire parable. At that time, the kingdom of heaven will be like. In other words, when all this kind of stuff starts going on, the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who've been invited to a wedding feast. And so they go to the wedding feast ready and waiting for the arrival of the bridegroom. And they're there with their lamps ready to greet that bridegroom when he arrives, when he appears. And on his appearing, they will trim their wicks and they will light their lamps and they will parade and process down the street and make their way to the banquet hall. Only problem is that 5 of the 10 forgot their oil. They didn't think to bring it. And so they asked the others, can we borrow some? And the others are like, but we've only got enough for our own lamps. Go down the street and get some. So they rush down the street to go get the oil that they don't have so they can participate in the procession of the bridegroom when he comes. And when they come back, they discover to their heartbreak that the bridegroom has come. And those who had the oil with them, they have entered into the banquet hall. And so anxiously they go to the door and knock. We got our oil now. A little late. but we got it. Only for the Lord to say, I don't know you. Just imagine. You've waited so long to be a part of something. Now, this whole thing about being prepared. I've been in pastoral ministry 32 years. The first wedding I ever conducted was in this church. Wasn't in this building. It's in the prayer garden. Some of you may remember Sue Shaver and her son Brian Anderson. He and his wife got married here in 1992, and it was the first wedding I ever did. And you know what? I haven't done a single wedding since that went right. Now, I don't want to overstate the case, because I've done a lot of weddings, and they've all gone fabulously well. But there's always something. One occasion, I'm standing there. At the time, I was doing a wedding at the hotel where I was a church planting pastor. Hadn't done a lot of weddings up to that point. Never occurred to me to give instructions to the photographer. So we're literally in the vows. I'm doing the vows with a couple, and I hear this almighty crash behind me. And I look behind me, and there's the photographer flat on her back. She had fallen over the small stage that we had created for the pastor and the couple to conduct the vows. Needless to say, I give instruction to every photographer from that time until today. On one occasion, I was doing a very lovely wedding. It couldn't have been more beautiful. And there I stood. And I usually have a small book with the wedding ceremony inside. And what I ask each groomsman or bridesmaid who has the rings to place the rings on the book. And they do. Now again, this was early on. And up to that point, I had managed to hold the rings for each wedding on my little book. Well, on this occasion, I happened to be wearing a robe. And I had my book, and I looked up and began to say something, and the rings slid down the book and down the creases of my robe, and I couldn't see where it had gone. There I stand in this rather elegant moment, couple before me, with the ring somewhere under me. So from now on, guess what I do? Whenever the ring hits the book, my index finger goes in between it. And I've done that for 29 years. Stuff happens. People get excited. People get enthusiastic. People get anxious. People get overly eager. And what does Jesus say about that? Pay attention and be prepared. Because all the enthusiasm you may have for the kingdom is essentially worthless if you're not giving due attention. Now, let me go back just one step and say one thing, and then I'll move forward, and then we'll finish. Jesus said, at that time, the kingdom of heaven will be. You know what that means? That means that the kingdom of heaven is being realized. It is present. It's going on. That's not a will be for when you die. That's a will be for when you're living. The kingdom of heaven, which has arrived for every person in this room. And if you've said yes to Jesus, then you are operating under the authority of the kingdom of heaven right now. You are in a heavenly outpost as a follower of Jesus. And in that outpost, you need to pay attention. You can be as enthusiastic as you want to, but if you don't pay attention, the wedding ring's going to end up under your gown, under your robe. Or as happened in the very first wedding I ever did in the prayer garden at the Parkwood Baptist Church, the table that we placed on the ground, put the legs up, or put them down, however you want to think about it, and put it in front of the little platform in the prayer garden. If you have a seat, you need to go down there. But we put a table there so when the couple came up, they could step on that table and not stand in the mud. And then once we got to the vows, they would then go up to the top of the platform. What we didn't realize is if you put a table in the mud, the table's going to sink in the mud. So we had a sunken table in the mud for the couple to stand on for the first 20 minutes of the ceremony. Didn't do that again either. My point is that there's something that we all have to grasp. There's two things, really. Firstly, that we're all operating in an outpost of heaven. That the kingdom of heaven is present and we've been authorized to be operators, to be engaged in it, to participate in it. And if we don't pay attention to the things of God under the rule of and authority of God, at an outpost of God, then we're likely to miss out on the good stuff, on the things you want to be a part of if you love God. You're going to miss out on the procession. Is there anything worse than going to a graduation ceremony and your loved one is number 435 out of 600 and you show up at number 487? What have you missed? All of that anticipation, all of that expectation, all of that possibility that you wanted to be a part of for so long has gone. It's passed you by. I'm here to tell you that if we're not giving due attention to the things of God, we're missing out on the good stuff. And if your life if you don't find your life as one that flourishes, if you're not finding your life as one that is peppered with delight and joy, if you're not finding a life that seems like it's the kind of life that anybody that lives in the life of God ought to have, then maybe we're not paying due attention. Because it's not like it's not here. It is. It's here in quantities. It's here in quantities beyond our imagining. Time and time and time again, I encounter folks who find their way to giving due attention to what God's up to. And they marvel They marvel at how transformative it is to be about the business of God, to give themselves to ministries, the purpose of which is to do something for someone other than themselves. To say to God, God, just use me. There's a dozen examples that you could just fire off in this church of where that stuff's going on. And give it some attention. Be a part of it. Say, you know what? I've never done that before, but I think I'm going to do it now. Because I can promise you that when you do, you're going to marvel at what you could have missed. Isn't it awesome when you think you want to go do something and you get there and it's beyond what you imagined? Or when a friend, or in my case, my lovely wife, encourages me to do something, says, oh, it'll be good. And you know in your heart of hearts, I'm going to hate every minute of this. I'm just going to hate it. I know I am. And you get there, and halfway through, you're like, this is not so bad. And when you get through, by the time you get in the car, you're saying, we ought to do this again. And they look at you like, really? Yeah, that was awesome. I had no idea. That's right, you had no idea. That's what Jesus is warning every one of us. You can literally go through your whole life from now till God calls you, and you can miss it all. Doesn't mean you won't be saved. You will. But you sure will have had a poor and degraded prospect. All he's inviting us to do, be prepared, pay attention, be ready. The things of the kingdom are going on. Amen.